The stadium held 80,000 people, and for 3 full seconds, every single one of them was silent. Idris Kamara stood over the ball, 18 yards from goal, score tied. The Continental Cup quarter-final had gone to penalties, and Valmoria's number 9, 22 years old, the fastest player most of these fans had ever watched with their own eyes, placed the ball on the spot with hands that were not shaking. Not yet. He struck it high. The goalkeeper for Castellan didn't even dive. The ball sailed over the bar by a foot and disappeared into a sea of blue and white flags. Valmoria was out of the tournament. Music. For one heartbeat, the stadium just breathed. Then it turned into noise, groans, curses. A grown man 3 rows from the pitch throwing his scarf onto the grass. Idris stood with his hands on his hips, chest heaving, staring at a patch of turf like it owed him something. He didn't know it yet, but the worst of it wasn't happening in that stadium. It was happening on phones. Thousands of them, all at once, all over the country. By the time the team bus pulled out of the parking lot, his name was the top trend in Valmoria. Not because of the miss, because of what people were saying about the boy who'd missed. Send him back to the jungle. Typical. Can't trust a monkey with the ball. We should have never let people like him wear the shirt. Someone posted a photo of Idris edited to look like an ape, side by side with his penalty miss. It had 11,000 shares before the bus reached the hotel. He read maybe 40 of the messages before his hands started shaking for real. Then he turned the phone face down on the seat beside him and looked out the window at a country that had loved him the day before. Man, imagine scoring for your whole life, and one miss undoes all of it. Let's back up. You need to understand who this kid was before we get to what happened next. Valmoria is a small country. If you're picturing it on a map, picture a coastline, a handful of industrial cities that used to build ships, and a capital, Saint-Avelin, where half the people work jobs that didn't exist for their parents. It's not a rich country. It's not a poor one either. It's the kind of place where everybody knows somebody who left for better work somewhere else, and everybody knows somebody who stayed and made do. Idris Kamara was born in Le Cordon, a housing block on the edge of Saint-Avelin where the elevators worked maybe half the time, and the football pitch was a strip of cracked concrete between 2 buildings, goals painted on with chalk that washed away every time it rained. His mother, Fatou, cleaned offices downtown, leaving before sunrise, coming home after dark 6 days a week. His father wasn't in the picture, hadn't been since Idris was 4. They didn't have much. Some months they didn't have enough. Fatou stretched a single chicken across 4 dinners. She patched Idris's school shoes with tape from the hardware store because new ones weren't in the budget that month, or the next one either. But here is the thing about Idris Kamara that people forget once the money and the fame arrive. He was fast before anyone paid him a cent to be fast. He was fast on that cracked concrete pitch with the chalk goals, fast running errands for his mother, fast enough that by age 7, the older boys in Le Cordon stopped picking teams by age and started picking them by who wanted Idris on their side. His coach in those early years was a retired factory worker named Bertrand Okafor, who ran a free after-school program out of a rented gymnasium 3 streets over. Bertrand had played professionally himself decades earlier for a small club that no longer exists. He never made it past the 2nd division, but he knew talent when it ran past him at 9 years old, and he told Fatou exactly that. "Your boy," he said, "he doesn't run like the others." Fatou didn't understand football. She understood work and rent and keeping her son somewhere warm and supervised until she got home. But she let him go to Bertrand's gym 3 nights a week, and on the 4th wall of that gymnasium, taped up crooked with yellowing tape, was a torn page from an old sports magazine, a photograph of a lean, coltish young winger from decades back, mid-stride, defenders left grasping at air behind him. Bertrand had kept that page since he was younger than Idris. He never explained why. He'd just point at it sometimes, mid-drill, and say, "That's what I want to see from you." Not fast. Idris used to stare at that torn photograph while he laced his shoes. He didn't know the player's full story. He just knew that somewhere, once, someone had run like that, and Bertrand believed he could too. He carried that page, literally the actual torn photograph. Once Bertrand finally gave it to him at 14, folded into quarters in his boot bag for the rest of his career. Through the academy trials, through his first professional contract at 17, through his debut for the senior national team at 20, it went everywhere his boots went. Nobody in the press ever wrote about it, because nobody ever asked. By 22, Idris Kamara was the fastest player in Valmoria's history, a starter for one of the biggest clubs in the region, and the face of a national team that hadn't reached a major final in 31 years. Sponsors wanted him. Children wore his number. Old men who'd never watched a match in their lives suddenly knew his name. He never forgot where the money went, either. The first serious contract he signed, at 18, he used part of the signing bonus to buy his mother a small apartment, 2 streets over from Le Cordon, nothing extravagant. Just a place with an elevator that worked and radiators that didn't need coaxing. She cried when he handed her the keys, and then immediately asked him if he'd eaten anything that day, because that was Fatou, and no amount of money was ever going to change the shape of her worry. He kept sending a portion of every paycheck to Bertrand's gymnasium, quietly, through a foundation with a name nobody connected to him, unless they went looking. New boots for kids whose feet had outgrown last year's pair. A proper roof, finally, after a decade of rain finding its way through gaps in the old one. Bertrand never asked where the money came from. He didn't need to. And then he missed a penalty, and for about 6 hours none of that mattered to a large, loud, and very online part of his own country. The Federation president was a man named Henri Duclos. Duclos had held the position for 11 years. He came from money his grandfather had owned, textile mills. His father had sat on the Federation's board before him, and he ran Valmorian football the way his family had always run everything, from a comfortable distance, with other people doing the actual work and his name on the letterhead. He was not, by nature, a cruel man. He was something worse in that moment, a comfortable one. Comfortable enough that when his phone started buzzing with reporters asking whether the Federation would condemn the racist abuse aimed at his own star player, his first instinct was to check what his sponsors were saying before he checked what was right. It took him 9 hours to release a statement. 9 hours while Idris sat in a hotel room with his phone off, unable to sleep, unable to eat the room service tray that went cold on the desk. When the Federation statement finally came, it was 4 sentences long. It did not use the word racism. It did not name what had actually been said. It did not mention Idris Kamara by name at all. His teammate and closest friend on the squad, a defender named Julien Vasseur, was the one who showed him the statement, reading it off his own phone in the hotel corridor at midnight. Idris said. Idris didn't sleep that night. In the morning, he asked for a meeting with Duclos before the team flew home. He got one. In a small conference room at the team hotel, just the 2 of them and a translator, who ended up not being needed because both men spoke the same language perfectly well, and simply didn't want to speak it to each other. "I'm not doing this anymore," Idris told him. Quiet, not shouting. He'd decided that much on the flight of thoughts through the sleepless night. He would not give Duclos the satisfaction of watching him lose his composure. Duclos folded his hands on the table. "Idris, emotions are running high. In a week, nothing changes, because nothing has to. That's the problem. You put out a statement that doesn't even say what happened to me. You know what was written under my photo last night?" Idris shook his head. The room went quiet, Outside, a delivery truck idled somewhere in the street below, its engine the only sound either man could hear. Duclos, to his credit or perhaps simply to protect himself, did eventually say the right things, a longer statement 2 days later, the word racism used 4 times, a promise to work with the League on reporting tools for abuse. But the damage of those first 9 hours of silence had already set. Idris had seen exactly how much the Federation valued him when the applause stopped. And it wasn't as much as he'd believed. He didn't quit the national team. Not officially, not on paper. But for weeks he stopped answering his phone when the Federation called. He skipped a scheduled sponsor appearance. He described that stretch, years later, in the only interview where he ever spoke about it at length, using a phrase that stuck with anyone who read it. We were like the walking dead. Not because we weren't good enough to lose that game. Everybody loses a game. The abuse didn't stay online. That's the part people underestimate. Back in Le Cordon, kids who used to wear Idris's replica shirt to school started leaving them folded in drawers. Bertrand found out about it 3 days later and sat with his head in his hands for a long time before he called Fatou. Fatou called her son. She rarely called during the season. She didn't like to be a distraction, but that day she called twice before he picked up. Maman, Idris said, I didn't ask if you were fine. I know you're not fine. Idris sat with that for a long moment on the other end of the line. What do I do? He said. Not really a question. You do what you've always done, his mother said. You get back up. Not for them. He didn't have an answer for her that night, but he kept that torn magazine photograph in his boot bag through every training session for the rest of that autumn, and every time he laced his boots, he thought about a 9-year-old with a bruised eye, waiting to see what his hero would do next. The abuse cost him more than sleep. 2 weeks after the missed penalty, a sportswear company that had used his face on billboards across the capital quietly let his endorsement deal lapse by mutual agreement, a phrase that meant nothing had been mutual about it at all. His agent, a sharp, weary woman named Corinne Fabre, who had represented him since he was 16, fought the decision for 3 days before telling him plainly there was nothing left to fight. They're worried about controversy, she said. Never mind that you didn't create the controversy. So I get punished for being called a monkey, Idris said. You get punished for being associated with being called a monkey. He didn't argue with her. There wasn't a version of arguing that would have changed the outcome. He simply noted quietly which companies had stood by him and which hadn't, and he never forgot the list either way. Inside the dressing room, the reaction split him from a few teammates he'd once considered close. Not everyone. Julien never wavered. Not for a single day. He was the one who sat with Idris on the flight home and said nothing at all for 2 hours, which turned out to be exactly what Idris needed. The Federation didn't discipline him for it. Idris read the quote once, said nothing publicly, and simply stopped passing to Astir in training for the better part of a month. A silent verdict that everyone in that dressing room understood perfectly well without a single word being exchanged about it. There were nights in that stretch when Idris genuinely considered walking away from the national team for good. Not the quiet, temporary withdrawal he'd announced to Duclos, but a real, permanent one. He told Corinne as much on the phone one evening, his voice flat with exhaustion. Club football I still love. This shirt I don't know anymore. Maybe it was never really mine to wear. Corinne let the silence sit for a moment before she answered. That's exactly the story they want you to believe, Idris. That you were only ever borrowing it. He didn't have an answer for her either, not that night. But something about the phrase stayed with him, don't hand them that win for free, the way Bertrand's old instructions used to stay with him, worn smooth from repetition until they became something closer to instinct than advice. Idris did return to the national team. 3 months later, quietly, No press conference, no grand statement, just his name, back on a squad list for a set of qualifying matches nobody outside Valmoria much cared about. He scored twice in his first match back. The crowd that had booed him during the abuse cycle cheered like nothing had happened, which was its own kind of ugly. But he took the cheering and gave nothing back except the football. That was the deal he'd made with himself. He would let his feet answer, and nothing else. He started visiting Le Cordon more that year than he had in the previous 5 combined. Not for cameras, he specifically told the club's media team he didn't want footage of it. He went to Bertrand's gymnasium on quiet weekday evenings, ran drills with 9- and 10-year-olds who could barely believe he was standing in front of them, and made a point, every single time, of finding Malik in the group and pulling him aside for 10 minutes of one-on-one work. "You know what happened to me last summer?" Idris told him once. Crouched down to the boy's eye level in that same gymnasium where he himself had once stared at a torn magazine page. People said something ugly, and for one day I let it make me feel small. You understand me? One day Malik nodded like he understood, the way 9-year-olds do mostly, and enough. "Your whole story isn't written yet either," Idris said. He never told a journalist about those visits. Bertrand did, years later, almost by accident, in a small radio interview nobody at the Federation ever planned or approved. By then it didn't matter what anyone thought of it. By then the whole country already knew who Idris Kamara was. A year is a long time to carry something. Over the months that followed, Idris rebuilt himself in pieces most people never saw. He changed his training routine, adding an hour of solitary finishing drills after every squad session, staying behind on the training pitch until the groundskeepers politely started turning off the floodlights around him. He worked with a sports psychologist for the first time in his career, a quiet, unhurried man named Dr. Orbin, who never once asked him to move past what had happened, only to understand it clearly enough that it stopped controlling him from underneath. "You don't have to forgive anyone, Doctor," Orbin told him in their first session. That sentence turned out to matter more than anything else anyone told him that year, because penalties inevitably came again in league matches, in cup ties, ordinary moments that any other season would have passed without comment. The first one, 4 months after the missed kick against Castellan, was watched by more people than the actual match around it, because everyone wanted to see whether the boy who'd missed the biggest penalty of his life could stand over another ball without flinching. He scored it low into the corner, sent the goalkeeper the wrong way, and didn't celebrate at all. He simply turned and walked back to the centre circle, the way he always had before any of this happened, as if the weight of 80,000 watching eyes was something he'd already decided not to carry. Corin renegotiated 2 new sponsorship deals that spring, both with companies that had specifically cited his conduct through the crisis as the reason they wanted him representing them: his calm, his refusal to be baited into a public war of words, his quiet work back in Les Cordons that had finally, despite his best efforts to keep it private, begun to leak into the press through people like Bertrand, who couldn't help but be proud. Idris used part of that new money to fund the resurfacing of the cracked concrete pitch where he'd learned to run in the first place. He never held a ribbon cutting, he just had it done. And one Tuesday afternoon, the kids in Le Cordon showed up to find real grass-effect turf and proper nets where chalk lines used to wash away in the rain. Roland Astier retired from international football that winter, quietly, with a short statement thanking the Federation for the opportunity. Nobody in the dressing room made much of it either way. Idris shook his hand once, at a farewell dinner neither of them particularly wanted to attend, and left it at that. Some grudges, he'd decided, weren't worth carrying onto a pitch. Others, the ones aimed at strangers hiding behind usernames, the ones that had reached a 9-year-old boy on a school playground he had no intention of ever letting go. Valmoria qualified for the Continental Cup final the following summer, the tournament's marquee edition, hosted that year in a stadium so large it swallowed the noise of 80,000 people into something closer to a low, constant roar. Their opponent in the final, Castellan. The same flag colours that had filled that stadium the day of the missed penalty, the same rival whose fans, a year earlier, had been the loudest voices flooding Idris's replies with slurs and monkey emojis after the ball sailed over the bar. The Federation, this time, did not stay quiet. Duclos, chastened by a year of criticism he never fully escaped, and perhaps genuinely changed by it, though nobody could say for certain which had spent the year building an actual reporting system for online abuse aimed at players, the kind of infrastructure that should have existed before the crisis instead of because of it. Idris read the quote and said nothing about it publicly. Privately, to Julian, he said only, "A year late." The morning of the final, in the hotel room, Idris opened his boot bag the way he had before every match for 8 years. The torn magazine photograph was there, folded into quarters, soft at the creases now from a decade of handling. He unfolded it, looked at it for a long moment, that lean, coltish figure mid-stride, defenders left grasping at air, and folded it back up. He didn't need luck. He needed exactly what that photograph had always represented. A reminder that speed like his wasn't given to be wasted on fear. Fatou was in the stands that day. For the first time in 3 years, she rarely travelled to away matches. Worried the noise and the crowds would overwhelm her, but for this one she'd asked Corinne to arrange the ticket herself, sitting quietly beside Bertrand in a section reserved for players' families. Idris spotted her during the warm-up, a small figure in a green scarf, 2 sizes too big for her, waving with both hands like she used to wave from the sideline of that cracked concrete pitch when he was 7 years old. He didn't wave back too many cameras. Too much attention he didn't want drawn to her, but he found her eyes for just a second and nodded. Once, and that was enough for both of them. In the tunnel before kick-off, the 2 teams lined up shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the signal to walk out. The Castellan goalkeeper, the same one from a year earlier, stood almost directly across from Idris in the narrow corridor, closer than either man probably would have liked. Neither of them spoke, but Idris caught him glancing over twice, and the second time something passed between them that wasn't quite an apology and wasn't quite anything else either, just the recognition, silent and mutual, that both of them remembered exactly what had happened in that other stadium a year before, and both of them understood this match was going to settle something that had nothing to do with the scoreline. The match itself, if you weren't there, went like this. Castellan scored first, 12 minutes in, a scrappy header off a corner that the Valmorian backline would spend the whole flight home arguing about. The stadium split almost exactly down the middle, blue and white against Valmoria's green and gold, roared its half of the noise into the sky. Idris didn't chase the moment. He'd learned, in the year since the missed penalty, that panic was a language his body didn't need to speak. He jogged back to the centre circle, said something to Julien that nobody caught on camera, and waited for the restart. The equaliser came in the 31st minute, and it was the kind of goal that ends up on every highlight reel made about that tournament for the next decade. A long ball out of Valmoria's defence, over the top, and Idris simply ran onto it the way Bertrand had once described to a 9-year-old on cracked concrete. Not fast, untouchable. The Castellan centre-back, a seasoned international who had never in his career been beaten for pace in a straight foot race, took 3 strides and understood he had already lost. Idris didn't slow down to take a touch. He met the ball in full stride, first time, low and hard, inside the near post, before the goalkeeper had finished setting his feet. He didn't celebrate wildly. He turned, pointed 2 fingers to his own temple, a gesture nobody outside his inner circle understood, though Julien did. It was what Bertrand used to tap on Idris's forehead after a good finish. That's where the real speed lives, and jogged back to his own half. The second goal came just before half-time, and this one had nothing to do with speed at all. Valmoria worked a short corner, and Idris, drifting to the edge of the box unmarked, because Castellan's defence had spent the whole half preparing for his pace, and forgetting he could also simply read a football match, met a cutback with the outside of his boot and curled it into the far corner. 2-1. The stadium's roar, this time tilted almost entirely toward green and gold. Castellan came back into it in the second half. They were, after all, the reigning continental champions, not a team that folded easily and equalised in the 68th minute through a penalty of their own, awarded after a clumsy challenge that replays would debate for weeks. 2-2, extra time loomed, and then, in the 89th minute, with the stadium's noise pressed down into something that felt almost physical, Castellan's goalkeeper, the same one who hadn't even bothered to dive a year earlier, when Idris's penalty sailed over the bar, came rushing out of his box to intercept a through ball he had no real chance of reaching. Idris got there first, rounded him with a single touch, and, with an open goal in front of him and 80,000 people holding their breath, he didn't rush the finish. He took the extra half-second, the one his coaches had spent a year drilling into him, the one that separates a footballer who's fast from a footballer who's untouchable, and rolled the ball into the empty net with something close to gentleness. Hat-trick. 3-2. The clock ran out 4 minutes later. In the commentary box, high above the pitch, a broadcaster who had called Valmoria's matches for over 2 decades found himself struggling for the right words as the final whistle blew. "I have seen a lot of football in this stadium," he said, his voice cracking slightly through the microphone, "but I don't think I have ever seen a young man answer a question this completely. A year ago, they asked him if he belonged." Down on the pitch, Julien reached Idris first, wrapping both arms around him before either of them said anything. "You did it," Julien said, half laughing, half in disbelief. "We did it," Idris corrected him, breathless. 90 minutes. But even as he said it, even as the rest of the squad piled around them in a knot of green and gold, Idris's eyes drifted up toward the family section, searching until he found the small figure in the oversized scarf, both hands pressed over her mouth, tears streaming freely down her face. Fatou Camara, who had cleaned offices before sunrise for 15 years so that her son could chase a ball across cracked concrete, watched him lift a continental trophy over his head and understood, in that moment, that every sacrifice had led exactly here. What happened after the final whistle is the part that made it into every retelling, the part that turned a football match into something bigger than a football match. Idris didn't run to the crowd. He didn't pull his shirt off. He walked, slowly, to the corner flag, nearest the section where, a year earlier, in a different stadium, for a different match, the worst of the abuse had first started trending on a phone screen. He could still picture perfectly. He wasn't performing for anyone. He simply stood there for a moment, looking up into a wall of noise, and then reached into his sock, the torn magazine photograph, folded into quarters. He'd carried it onto the pitch that day for the first time in his career. Usually it stayed in the boot bag, a private thing, and now he unfolded it, held it up for a camera he hadn't planned on being there, but which found him anyway, and then folded it carefully back into his sock, over his heart, the way you'd put away something too important to leave lying around. Nobody watching understood what the photograph was. The clip went viral within the hour anyway, because sometimes people don't need to understand a gesture to feel the weight of it. He gave one interview, on the pitch, still breathing hard, a microphone shoved toward his face by a reporter who asked the obvious question, "A year ago, people called you a monkey after a missed penalty." Tonight you scored a hat-trick in a continental final. What do you want to say to them? Idris looked into the camera for a long moment before he answered. I'm not going to say anything to them, he said. They don't deserve my words. I already gave them my answer. He paused, and something in his face softened. This one's for a kid named Malik back home, and every kid like him who got called something ugly because of what happened to me. You don't owe anybody an explanation for existing. The clip of that answer outlasted the highlights of the hat-trick itself. It was translated into 11 languages within a week. The Federation held a reception 2 nights later, the kind of formal affair Idris usually avoided. All handshakes and photographs with men in suits who hadn't kicked a ball competitively in decades. He went anyway, because Bertrand had asked him to, and because there was one thing left he wanted to say in a room where it would actually be heard. Idris let him get about halfway through it before he spoke. That first statement, the one that took 9 hours and didn't use the word racism once. Duclos's smile thinned slightly. Idris, I think we've both grown a great deal since. I'm not trying to embarrass you tonight. I scored 3 goals 2 nights ago. Idris kept his voice level, the same tone he'd used in that hotel conference room a year earlier. I just want you to remember, the next time it's not me. The next time it's some kid nobody's ever heard of, playing in a league nobody's watching, and it happens to him instead. I want you to remember how long 9 hours felt to me, and I want you to move faster than that. He didn't wait for a response. He shook Duclos's hand, firm, brief, entirely correct, and walked back across the room to where Bertrand was standing with a glass of orange juice, looking prouder than Idris had ever seen him look. You didn't have to say that to him, Bertrand said quietly. No, Idris agreed. The Federation's abuse reporting system, the one Duclos had built under pressure that year, ended up being used for the first time in an official capacity 4 months later, not for Idris, but for a 19-year-old winger on the youth national team who received a wave of similar messages after a missed chance in a qualifying match. The Federation responded within 6 hours this time, named it plainly, supported the player publicly, immediately, without hedging, 6 hours instead of 9. It wasn't perfect. Idris, watching from home, texted Julia a single line about it. Getting there. Malik, the 9-year-old with the bruised eye, is 14 now. He plays for Bertrand's academy team. The same cracked concrete has since been repaved, with real goals thanks to a small sponsorship Idris arranged and never once mentioned publicly. Malik keeps a photograph in his own boot bag, not a torn magazine page this time. A printed still from a broadcast. Idris Kamara, on one knee at a corner flag, unfolding a piece of paper for 80,000 people who didn't understand what they were watching, and one boy back home who understood completely. Bertrand still runs the gymnasium 3 nights a week, though his knees complain more than they used to, and he leans on a cane now that he pretends he doesn't need. He never talks much about that night at the reception, the champagne and the suits, and the young man he'd coached since age 7 standing his ground in front of a Federation president. But sometimes, mid-drill, watching Malik or one of the younger kids chase a ball across the resurfaced pitch, he'll stop everything and point the same way he used to point at a torn magazine photograph taped crooked to a gymnasium wall. That's what I want to see, he tells them. Not fast. None of them know yet what that word cost the man who first taught it to him. They only know it works. The way instructions worth keeping always do pass down, worn smooth, carried in a boot bag until somebody is ready to hand it to the next person in line. Julien Vasseur, still Idris's closest friend on the national team, has told the story of that silent 2-hour flight home more than once. Usually to younger players who join the squad and don't understand yet why Idris seems to carry himself the way he does. Calm in a way that looks almost unbothered until you understand what it actually is. He's not calm because nothing gets to him, Julian tells them. He's calm because he decided, a long time ago, exactly what's allowed to get to him and what isn't. That's not the same thing. Corinne Fabre still represents him. She keeps framed on the wall of her office a printout of that single line she'd texted him during the darkest stretch of that year. Don't hand them that win for free. When new clients come through her door, young players just starting to understand what the game will ask of them beyond the 90 minutes on the pitch, she sometimes points to it and tells them the whole story, start to finish, ending always with the same instruction. Whatever they take from you, don't let them take the story too. Somebody online, in the days after that final, wrote a comment that got shared almost as widely as the hat-trick itself. They thought a missed penalty could define him. He let them wait a year to find out how wrong they were. Idris never commented on it. He didn't need to. His answer had already been given, in full, on a pitch in front of 80,000 people and however many million more watching from home, not with words, but with a run nobody could catch, a photograph folded into a sock, and a boy back in Le Cordon who now believes, the way Idris once believed watching a torn magazine page on a gymnasium wall, that somebody like him can be untouchable too. Duclos, for his part, remains Federation president to this day, though he speaks of that year differently now than he did at the time. Less as a controversy he managed, and more, in his rare honest moments, as the closest he ever came to understanding what it actually costs someone to carry a country's hopes, while a portion of that same country decides, over a single missed kick, that he was never really one of them to begin with. He keeps, on his own desk now, a copy of the second statement he issued, the one with the word racism used 4 times, not the first, hollow one. He says it's there to remind him how fast is fast enough. Whether that's true, or simply the kind of thing a man tells himself once the cameras are gone, only he really knows. This was never just a game. For a 9-year-old with a bruised eye, for a mother who cleaned offices before sunrise, for a coach who kept a torn photograph taped to a wall for 30 years, waiting for the right person to hand it to, it was a stance. A quiet, stubborn refusal to let cruelty write the last word. So here's the question worth sitting with. The next time someone tries to make you small for one bad moment in an otherwise full life, what will you let it turn you into? And who's watching you find out?